speaker comes from our institute, Associate Professor of AI and Computational Neuroscience. So he's more on the computational neuroscience. I'm not even sure if it's computational neuroscience, but mostly on the neuroscience and psychology side, utilizing the knowledge of AI and helping both ways. He's our own Associate Professor Jaan Aru, who also is a best-selling author in Estonian. He has written several books in Estonian, and for first half of the year, I think the local bookstores sold his book the most in Estonia. Give it a thought. So in the past, what types of books are selling the most? So I hope that this is the scientific book. In the previous years, many years back, we had another best-selling author, Christian Korjus, and Jaan's brother, Jaan Aru, with the mathematical õhtuõpik that did the trick for mathematics education. But Jaan, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm super happy to be here, and I will not talk about my book. If anyone wants to hear about it, come and ask during the breaks. I'm happy to share these ideas. But today I'm here for you to share some ideas with you. It looks like an amazing summer school. I hope you will make a lot of friends, and I hope you will actually also get a lot of good ideas. And that's what I will also talk about. I will talk about how we actually come to good ideas, because I've been fascinated for a long time about this question of, how do we come to new types of solutions, be it in business, be it in science, arts. And I thought that this is a good topic to discuss today, because all of us here need to come up with new ideas. If you're in science, you need to come up with ideas of new experiments, ideas of new papers, ideas of how to get your thesis done, right? If you're more on the business side, perhaps you want to be the next big thing when it comes to startups. You need to have a good idea, right? And even if your goal is to simply to be a very good software developer, still, what makes a very good software developer very good is the fact that he or she can come to new ideas, come to new solutions. And as Jaak already alluded to, I approach this question from many sides. So AI is one of the topics I work on, but I also work on psychology and neuroscience, and I always believe that we can come to good ideas when we actually combine different fields. So that's what I do. So in our research, we ask questions such as, how does this work? So when we come to some new ideas, what happens in our brain? And here in the institute, part of the research is about trying to figure out whether these algorithms are worth also to be implemented in artificial intelligence. However, I will not focus so much on these two topics today, but rather I thought that for you, for the members and the attendants of the summer school, maybe it's the best way to go about it is to actually think how can you come to new ideas, give some tips and tricks, and so this is the main focus of today. As Jaak already said, if you have questions, feel free to ask. I will also make some short breaks to give you the possibility to ask questions. Okay? So, but first tip, when you want to be good at anything, be that science or arts or whatever. You have to go to the people who are on top of their field, who have done something that you want to do, and you have to study how they actually did it. And in the case of the question of how we come to new ideas, there is one very good example I like, and this is Andrew Wiles. Some of you, of course, know who he is. He's the guy who solved Fermat's last theorem. I think many of you know it, but just to put it up here also, this is Fermat's last theorem. In the end, something that is very simple to grasp, but it turns out very difficult to solve. And the kind of the part of the story I like is that Pierre Fermat wrote into his notes, basically, on a small margin there, he wrote, "Oh, I have discovered a truly marvelous proof of this, which this margin is too narrow to contain." So we don't know whether he was bluffing or whether he really had it. In any case, in his documents, people have never found an existing proof. And this was then 1637, right? And for the next 3.5 centuries, mathematicians were trying to figure out what this proof could be or how you would actually prove it. And Andrew Wiles then was this person who actually solved it. And what's telling about it is that he took 7 years for it. And he started actually in secrecy. So he didn't tell others that he was working on this proof because so many had failed before him in the previous 3.5 centuries. And there is a nice book that describes how this solution came about and all this process. I just picked up one quote for today that for me is a good way to kind of start thinking about the problem. And it's a lengthy quote, so I will basically introduce it sentence by sentence. So here, Andrew Wiles is describing basically the solution process in general of how he tackles mathematical problems, and he says that you have to think about it like that you enter the first room of the mansion and it's completely dark. You're in complete blackness. You stumble around, bumping into the furniture, but you gradually learn where each piece of furniture is. So this is what he is saying about his solution process. And you see, it doesn't really sound very motivating, or it doesn't sound. Is there a problem? But then he goes on to say this. Finally, after 6 months or so, you find the light switch, you turn it on, and suddenly it's all illuminated. You can now see exactly where you were. So you were stumbling around in the dark room, and now you see the switch, and now you see, oh, okay, this was actually the couch, this was, I bumped there into the table, etc. And then he goes on to say that then you move into the next room and spend another 6 months there in the dark. So I think this is it's something very illuminating for us, because we see that we like to think about the coming to new ideas, that you have these sudden flashes and then you will be rich and famous, but it's not like that. And many of you know it, but today we want to better understand how this process then comes about and what can we actually do. And I think the best sentence from this quote is this in the end, that he says that, so each of these breakthroughs, while sometimes they're momentarily, sometimes over a period or a day or two, they are the culmination of, and couldn't exist without, the many months of stumbling around in the dark that preceded them. kind of the first bigger point I want to make today is that, you know, whenever your goal is to come up with a new idea, then yeah, it sounds fancy and glamorous and it's nice to come to a new idea, but the process is about stumbling around in the dark. And the main point I want to make is that, you know, there's no way around it. So if you want to come to new ideas, you want to do something that's novel, you have to be able to do this actually. You need to be able to, you know, be there and stumble around in darkness. And this is just one quote, but here's kind of I wanted to bring another kind of maybe even a darker quotation about it, and this comes from the Estonian composer Arvo Pärt, who basically he had years of crisis where he wanted to create new music, but he didn't know how to do it. And then here's a quote where he describes that situation, and he writes that it's life and death agonizing inner conflict. So basically, of course, especially for the PhD students amongst us, I don't mean that, you know, your PhD should be life and death agonizing inner conflict. But what I mean is that, you know, when it sometimes is a bit, then that's part of the game, or, you know, you have to see that this is how it sometimes has to be. And the kind of the bottom line of this is that, you know, often we see it in society also. We overvalue talent, or always say that, oh, they are really gifted. But what's really important when it comes to making new discoveries, coming up with and building up new startups, etc., is that you have to be able to do this stumbling around in the dark. You have to be able to struggle. And of course, it's very important to, you know, here also discuss what kind of struggle do we actually mean, because again, when I'm talking about this struggle, then I don't mean that, you know, your supervisor should be an asshole, and, you know, your supervisor should be yelling at you, and this kind of a struggle. I also don't mean that your kind of lab mates should be stealing your ideas, or that they should be distracting you when you're working. But I mean this kind of a very specific type of struggle that we see when we study the works of different people from science, arts, business. And this kind of struggle we could frame like this, that this is the struggle of innovation, where you need to balance being appropriate while being original in the quest of actually achieving your goals, the things you want to do, the novel things you want to achieve. And for me, this really consists of these three different pieces here. One of which is that, you know, you have to be original, but I think we forget these two other parts. One is that, you know, to actually be original and to come to new ideas, I mean, you have to have some kind of a goal. You want to achieve something, you want to do something. So original ideas, they don't come just like that. They come to people who actually search for original ideas and want to do that. And even worse is that we mostly, when we discuss about coming to new ideas or being creative, then we forget about this aspect that your work also has to be appropriate to the kind of the topic or the field where you're working on. And I think people, you know, we all appreciate originality, we think about originality, but even when we look at great pieces of art, then they have to have these other components. And just to bring one example, here's Michelangelo's
the ceiling of Sixtine Chapel in Rome. And yes, we celebrate it as a very original piece of art, but we can also now contemplate the constraints there were in this specific piece of art, right? Well, you have to, it's a constraint that you have to paint on a ceiling that has these kinds of different, pieces of architecture there, right? So you only can paint here in these specific places. There you have this specific grid-like structure you have to take into account. And even more, of course, the content you provide onto that painting, it also has its constraints and its kind of things it has to contain and things it cannot contain. So this is something to keep in mind, that we often cherish originality, but artists, composers, scientists, business people, they also make use of the constraints that you have. That every specific problem has its own constraints, and it's actually a good thing. I will come back to this. So let's look at these kind of three components. The first thing is, of having a goal, that you have some kind of idea of what you want to actually achieve. If you're in science, it might be that you want to solve a specific problem. You want to create a specific tool. And many of us perhaps come to science with this kind of idea that, yeah, I will find something, and my supervisor, he or she has the project for me, I will work on that. But the point I want to make is that if you want to make a novel contribution, you want to come to new ideas, then you actually yourself have to figure out what is the specific thing I want to do. What is the specific question you want to answer? If you're writing a paper, then what is the specific goal of that? What is the audience? What do you want to give to them? And the general rule is that the more precise you can make the goal, the better your work can also be, because then you're working with some goal in mind. The other thing that I already mentioned about is this level of appropriateness, which means that you want to actually know the field. You want to know the players, who are the authors, who are the other people doing the same business. You want to know the bits and pieces of that field. And again, it's not about science, it's also about art, it's about when you do business, right? And as said, this is, I think, the most underrated kind of thing that we want to be appropriate, and we actually want to play with the constraints. So think about it briefly. And I just to bring one specific example, when we write scientific papers, then we write them, for example, for some journal, and different journals, they actually have their own kind of constraints. Some have constraints about how long the introduction can be. In AI, often we have this section of background and related work, but when we go to neuroscience, for example, you don't have this kind of a section. If you write to some very high journal, it has its own constraints. That, for example, the introduction is very short, or you should say this and that in the introduction only. And this seems like a limiting factor. What I want to tell you is that you should actually embrace it. You should use it. For example, one PhD student amongst us, I don't know if he's here today, told me that, for one of his papers, he actually took another paper from some other authors and basically used their structure of the argument, how they wrote the introduction, how they wrote where they started their methods, etc. And you might think, oh, that's stealing, but that's not. because, of course, he didn't steal the ideas. He only looked at the structure. And this is actually a very good kind of a technique even to get to know the field or to learn these constraints of a field that you, for example, in science, you look at some papers that are very good, that you like, and you try to really dissect them. Okay, why do they have this kind of a first sentence? How do they finish the first paragraph? What's the point they're making with the first paragraph? You try to go through that. Perhaps if you want to be kind of more detailed, you could even try to write a paper similar to that, not by looking, but basically by learning and then writing a paper like that. And this might sound like a very stupid method, but actually people like Benjamin Franklin used this method to become good writers. So you should not always try to be original in every sense, but rather you should learn the constraints of your topic in science, in business, in arts, and then make use of these constraints. Or another way to say it is that, if somebody reads your paper when we are scientists, if somebody reads your paper, and it's too novel, they cannot understand the first sentence because you're coming up with your own kind of words and your own symbols, well, they won't read it past the first sentence. You first want to demonstrate that you know the field. You appreciate what has been done in the field before. You want to show it, and then add your pieces of originality. And this is the third factor from here, right? That you want to learn what others have done. You want to have a goal, but of course, when we're talking about coming up with new ideas, then you also want to be original, right? So you want to learn what is there, but then add on top of that your, let's say, 30% of originality, because this is what matters. But the rest also is important. The rest gives this kind of a structure to actually understand your originality. And if you look at, great arts, you look at startups, you look at science, then always the big ideas, they come like that you know the field, and then you want to add your original part. And, I have told this story to some of you, so sorry, but I think this is a good story worth repeating, that, when we were with Professor Raul Vicente, we were in Frankfurt, then we had there a group leader, a PI, who was, let's say, original. And he, sometimes he went and drew some strange equations on the blackboard, basically saying that he knows, he has figured something out about the brain, and we all don't know it. And then I was a PhD student. I was really looking forward to his paper, where he explains all these ideas. But when he sent me that paper, I basically said, yeah, send it to me, I'm super keen to read it. And he sent that paper. I could not understand it because he really made up kind of new symbols and new words to describe different things. And now I basically understand that, he was super original, but he wasn't appropriate. He wasn't trying to build on what others did. He wasn't trying to play with the constraints, but he was simply inventing all of the stuff on his own. That's nice, interesting, but that's not really what science is. Science is also about systematically building upon, putting your new idea into the context of what others have done, right? He didn't do that. So I actually wrote to him in a manner that, that I usually do, kind of trying to stay humble while a bit arrogant. And I wrote that, sorry, I cannot understand it, and, probably there's something wrong with me. And he replied, yes, basically. Try harder. My wife could understand it, why you cannot? And over years, actually, I think I was a stupid PhD student, but I was right, because the field hasn't really, taken his big new idea as something that is revolutionary. And lately, he had a new paper up in archive, and I could understand a bit more of that. So I wrote to him, and then he actually replied to me, Jaan, sorry, back then you were not stupid. The paper was too hard to understand. So yeah, finally, after what it is, 10 years, he got it. So it takes time sometimes, and that's why today I want to tell this thing to you already now, before you get lost into being too original. We need to be original. I encourage you to be original. However, you have to know the constraints and be original within those constraints to actually make others appreciate your work. Okay? Are there any questions so far, or comments? Questions can also be original. Yeah. Okay. So I think it's always good to kind of also have some kind of analogies, or how we think about this kind of process and problem. And the analogy I use usually to think about this process of coming up with new ideas and learning something is the analogy of actually building Legos. And I like it because those of you who know Legos very well, there are thousands of different types of Lego pieces. And these are like knowledge pieces that you, for example, collect today here in the summer school, but you collect in your life, you collect during your studies, for example. And that this process of creating something or coming to new idea is like building some kind of a new machine or invention from these Legos. Because with this analogy, we immediately see that, one thing is about combining different pieces, but what we see more importantly is that this is a process. It's not something you can immediately come up with, but rather you need to try a lot, you need to combine these different pieces. Sometimes you need to actually take apart what you have built. And we also understand that, these pieces themselves, they give you some constraints. Sometimes you want to invent a new piece, sometimes you can do it. And even more importantly, what we understand also is that, to become a good builder of Legos, it's good actually to look at the works of others. It's good even to follow the instructions of some machines, for example, that have been built from Lego. Because otherwise, perhaps you never thought of that you could use these 6 pieces to form this kind of a machine. Now you have that. Somebody else invented that, but you can build on top of that. And that this process of coming up with new ideas, this process of being creative is like building a Lego. However, analogies can only get you so far. So the question we've been asking is whether you have something like that, this combination of different pieces in the brain also. How does this combination of pieces happen in our brains? And then we can also later ask, could we do something like that in machines? And to kind of get to that point, I will make a small detour, but I think it's a bit interesting. But I will tell you a bit about this brain structure called hippocampus, and I want to make you familiar with the most famous patient in the history of neuroscience. This is the patient HM. By now, he's dead already. However, he made a very fundamental contribution to neuroscience because before his case, we didn't know where memories reside in our brain. We kind of had this assumption that memories are kind of everywhere, all structures are equally important. And that's why when this person had epilepsy, they decided to remove the hippocampus from both sides. So those of you who have seen their own brain from below know that, here's something is missing here and here. So basically they, already back then, this was in the beginning of 1950s, they could actually do this surgery. Basically they put in two very thin knives and with that removed the hippocampus from both sides. And obviously they thought that this will not have any effect on the person, or that it will be mild, but then it turned out that this person cannot really form new memories. So it would be completely useless for this person to be here in this audience, for example. He couldn't remember anything from the summer school. And you all had this great lunch now, so most of you are tired, and so you also won't remember most of what I am saying here, right? But at least you will remember that there was this tiny bald guy who showed a damaged brain, right? You will remember that. But he wouldn't. So he wouldn't remember that at all. And this was then really the starting point for a lot of research into understanding what are the mechanisms of our memory. And the other point, which is kind of a curiosity, but I wanted to make you, is that, these days we have a lot of different criteria for how famous someone is, and in science, we look at citations and, who has more citations, etc. But I think patient HM very well defined what it really means to be famous, because when this brain was sliced, so you see, here's this brain in ice, and here's a big knife that will come and cut it into thin slices. Then this brain slicing was broadcasted and watched by hundreds of thousands of people in YouTube. So this is what it means to be famous in science, actually. Yeah, let's see if any one of us can top that. Now, this was a detour about hippocampus and being famous, but what I really wanted to come to is that, then in this century, actually, research has shown that hippocampus is not only about memory, but it's also about combining pieces, and, it's for imagining things, for coming to new ideas. And I just wanted to highlight one paper because I think there's another interesting curiosity here. The paper itself has a boring title. Basically, the patients with hippocampal lesions or amnesia cannot imagine new experiences. But what's interesting here is that you probably know this first author. It's not the person with the same name, but it's actually the same person. It's actually the CEO of DeepMind, Demis Hassabis, who before being a CEO in DeepMind did a very successful PhD in neuroscience. And this paper really has been a breakthrough paper in the field of understanding kind of what hippocampus does. And then, of course, Demis Hassabis went on to found DeepMind and do stuff that has been even more influential. But it's interesting, I think, and it's interesting and good to know also that he did his PhD in neuroscience. And the final curiosity here is that, this paper was communicated to PNAS by Endel Tulving, who is actually an Estonian-born memory researcher, who is most appreciated by his creativity. And he is still alive and still very keen to learn how we do these things in Estonia also. Okay, so this was what Demis Hassabis found, that basically if you have patients who have this hippocampal amnesia, then they cannot really imagine new things. So you tell them, for example, imagine being on a beach and sitting with your friends. They cannot really do it. And then research since that, so in the last 15 years, has shown many, many other findings about that, that all show that the hippocampus is important for coming to new ideas. And we then made this kind of a cartoon figure that, hippocampus is here, and it has these kind of pieces of knowledge, concepts, kind of different memories that you have. That's okay, we knew that, but what we are saying is that actually what hippocampus does is that it puts these different pieces of knowledge together and sends them to cortex. So basically, that within this system of processing that is happening in your brain, you have another system that is by itself trying to combine different pieces and sending up these different kinds of ideas. What kinds of knowledge pieces they are? Now, for example, it might be something that you learn here today. It might be something that you discussed during the lunch break. It might be something that you discussed yesterday or the week before, right? Something that you saw, something curious. And what we are saying, and other people are also saying, is that the hippocampus is basically combining these pieces and sending them to the cortex. So the cortex is basically, if you don't know, the cortex is the system that is more similar to these today's deep neural networks, and especially recurrent neural networks. But the point is that this system, that for example inside a deep learning system, it gets input from the outside, it gets a label, or it learns it in self-supervised way. Here, in our brain, is also getting this kind of a seemingly sometimes random input from the hippocampus that tries to combine different pieces of knowledge. And what we think and what our hypothesis is that, this is what the hippocampus does. It basically is combining these different pieces. It does it in specific time that I will tell you in the next part. And what we think is that often these ideas, they are not really they are stupid. I mean, we all come to stupid ideas sometimes, or at least I do quite often. But what sometimes happens is that almost maybe semi-randomly, this combination of the pieces that it puts together actually is a great idea and actually leads to this, aha, okay, now I understand, now I see. So that inside your brains there is this machine that really we could think of that combines these kinds of Lego pieces, tries to put them together, and sometimes, only sometimes, good ideas come out of it. And we, from the side of neuroscience and psychology, we're trying to understand how this system works. But of course, from the side of AI, we could also basically ask, could we use these systems? Could we build something like that? That basically has this, we could call it like a almost random generator inside the system. But of course, the point I'm making is that it's not completely random. Otherwise, we would always come to only random ideas, right? But rather, it has to have some kind of a purpose or some kind of a way of figuring out what a good idea is. And this is why it's difficult actually to put this thing into AI, or at least today we don't have a system that really does it, is because we don't know how it works in the brain. So the question is, for example, which pieces of knowledge should you combine? How should the system kind of select from all these millions of pieces which things to try together? The second thing we don't know, but there are some advances, is, okay, if you take now random pieces, they don't really fit together. So what kind of operation do you have to do to put some things together that you see and hear in very different contexts, right? It seems that you have to be able to extract this knowledge to some conceptual level. What is that? And then you need to be able to combine it. And finally, or I mean, one more thing, that is you have to be able to actually evaluate this output. You need to have another system that looks at the output and says, okay, this is actually a good idea, or this is crap, right? Otherwise, it would be just crap. Which it, of course, often is in people also, but we don't want to build systems like that, or do we? Okay, so this was kind of a detour into how our brains actually try to come to new ideas, how our brains actually build new knowledge. And I think it's a good place to also ask whether you have any questions or you want to discuss something. As we already said, you can have original questions. You can have something that you think is not related, perhaps it is. There's one question behind you. Thank you very much for opening it up.
Thank you for the presentation so far. It's very interesting. I had this feeling that you said how to combine these ideas. For me, I had this belief that you should get some kind of foundational knowledge to kind of start building upon new ideas, that you can somehow find out what are the kind of axioms, so to say, that what is right about the world, and you kind of deep ingrain that in your brain, and you start building knowledge upon that, and that kind of allows kind of combining when it comes to it, when you get some far in your knowledge, to actually get these novel connections. Do you think what do you think about this idea of having kind of core beliefs in place?
Yeah, and then I mean, that's why I put this slide, that when you build a Lego, also you build a big machine, you start from somewhere. You start from the core of the machine or from the foundation, and it determines what you can actually also build upon it, right? And you have to, when you build the other pieces of the machine, you have to take into account what was there before, right? And as in a Lego, also in our thoughts, it's very hard to go to these core beliefs and change that. But it's a very interesting question of how we can do it. And sometimes, which we see throughout the history of mankind, is that the big problem of why innovation cannot happen is that we have some kind of a core beliefs, or we haven't thought of this thing that you could, for example, have parking houses where cars drive and are there on different floors, that you could have mobile phones, etc., right? That sometimes, and this is where the innovation happens, you have to go to these core beliefs and change that. But this is a very important question of also why some people have very rigid core beliefs and why others are more flexible. Can we teach that? How to actually, you can identify your core beliefs, be it in your scientific field or in your personal life, and how you can see the problems with them. So this is something we also study and we are very much interested in. Yeah, thanks. Any other questions? Yeah, thank you.
So one of the big aims of AI is computational creativity. And I think your metaphor of stumbling in the dark isn't so bad, because what computer systems are mostly doing is going through a big search space, right? And the problem, of course, is that you somehow have to predefine the search space. So eventually, the question is that really creative? And to what extent are computers really able to be creative? Now there are recent examples which are quite amazing, actually, where computers are producing music, are computing art, and so on. And my question actually is, what do you think about this form of creativity? Is it really creativity or not? And what perhaps can AI learn from neuroscience to make computers more creative?
Yeah, these are all excellent questions, and I think most of the people here also are kind of familiar with the big breakthroughs that have really happened over the last years in text generation, and especially this year in image generation, where you can really type in some kind of text, and then AI, for example, DALL-E 2 or Google's Imagen or Party or many different systems actually can generate you a very beautiful artwork. And definitely it kind of redefines kind of creativity. I think there are at least currently there are two camps at least. So one is saying that this is very bad for creativity because otherwise you had to learn all these skills of doing, for example, digital arts. Just this spring we had Nerva here, who is a digital artist who has to do a lot of work to get his art done. Now you could basically give this kind of a task to a machine who would, of course, not often perform at the level of Nerva, but still very fast generate very amazing art forms. And that this kind of devalues human creativity, and maybe the main point that I want to make, and I usually make to school children, is that, and I made today also, is that creativity is not about the output, because currently AI systems already can top us on many aspects of the output, but creativity is also about the process, that you kind of, the output might be not so good, but you're learning a lot in between about yourself and about the process. And the second camp then is, of course, who says that all of this is very good, we should fully embrace it, and this can make us even more creative. So I think this is a completely different talk that one could give on this topic. But the question really then that is also the key for me is, can we use systems like that for this for AI creativity? And when we think about these systems that I briefly now mentioned from Google, OpenAI, and other companies, then they are very different from that, right? They are very good systems for taking the text and turning it to complex transformations into images, for example. But this system is very different. It's a system that is like competing with the processing we are doing in our daily life. For example, most of you are kind of listening to my talk, or maybe not most, maybe most is too much, but some of you are listening to my talk, but in the brains of many of you already, this system is working. It's coming up with some kind of ideas that some of them are completely not related to what we're talking here now. Some are more or less related, but this is a competing system that kind of tries to combine these bits and pieces and come to really different solutions. But we'll see how much these kinds of systems are needed. Currently, definitely there is this boom, as you also said, and most of the creativity researchers are also kind of a bit afraid of what it all means. Yeah. But these are exciting times, especially for students of computer science. Yeah.
I also have a question about brain part. So what is the relationship between the memory, short, long memory, creativity, ideas, in terms of chemistry versus electric signaling in the brains? Chemistry seems to be more long-term stable somehow, and electric is very transient, quick.
Yeah, so this is it's another very important topic also for discussing about AI, because in the brains, you have the neurons, the neural network, which, I mean, in some approximation is similar to a deep neural network. But what the chemicals actually can do is they can completely switch up the architecture of this system. So this is very interesting that, you know, this happens because, I mean, as you also know, in neurons we have different, you know, receptors for different chemicals. And if you now increase noradrenaline or serotonin, for example, this will selectively enhance the processing in some parts of your brain while downgrading the others. So actually, this, in some sense, the chemical changes when you maintain a kind of a constant chemical milieu, then yeah, then it's more like slower time. But if you know you get scared, probably it doesn't happen to you, but you know, you listen, you hear a very good idea, for example, you get excited, then this means that, you know, a chemical is released, and this actually changes the way your processing happens. And this is something that, you know, today's AI systems are not so much making use of. And for creativity, I think one aspect that definitely matters is that you are able to, and I will now go in the second part, go more deep into that. You are able to relax, go into this relaxed mode, and then when you have a good idea or you listen to a good idea, you can suddenly go into this very efficient processing mode. It's something that today's AI systems do not do, but our brain is generally good at. Yeah.
So one more question. One thing I remember is this kind of computer science has concept of explore versus exploit, and I think it applies here very well as well. That generating new ideas, that you should kind of combine older knowledge pieces to generate new ideas. But now the question is, how much should I explore this area? Like you have 3 disciplines that you combine together to find new ideas. You could go further. You could add more and more and more fields. But when should you kind of stop exploring fields, and when should you start combining, generating your new ideas? Do you have any, I don't know, heuristics to when to exploit knowledge, when to kind of start combining it, when to stop looking, and when to start exploiting in a sense?
The main heuristic here is that people and also scientists are very different in that respect. There are scientists who are very good because they stick to one field, they exploit it, and they can go very, very deep. For example, I'm not one of these persons, as I showed you in the opening slide. Also, I like to combine different things. And I think during the process of your PhD or your postdoc, you kind of have to learn what kind of a person are you? Where are you comfortable? Are you comfortable in one topic and you want to go deep there, or you actually want to combine different ideas? You have to try both. Otherwise, you cannot learn which of those 2 you are. Okay? So this is the main heuristic, actually. Keep it in mind that, you know, there's not one rule for all. Good luck with that. Okay, yeah, there's another question there. Yeah, thanks. It's great to have questions and to discuss these things. Yeah.
Meanwhile,
oh yeah, thanks.
You showed us a pretty picture of hippocampus sending signals, and cortex is selecting what's going on. How far is comparing it to quantum computers? It's almost same for me, at least. You have all possibilities. You just need to select.
Yeah, this is something where, you know, I say that you probably know more than me. I know about hippocampus and cortex. I don't know about quantum computing, but perhaps it's an exciting thing to discuss later. So thanks. Yeah.
So my question is about a little bit down the line. So as far as I understand, the objective of all this studying of the brain is to figure out how this brain thingy works, and hopefully we will put it together and replicate the processes, even though it's a concern of maybe down the line in, I don't know, decades or centuries ahead of us, but assuming that we figure it out and we put it together, so this factory of new ideas could be actually replicated by a machine, then what should be our concern at that point? I mean, if we are all about these new ideas and creativity, so is it something that we should at all think about it now, or is it, how do you see it?
Yeah, I mean, it's this is partly already we discussed it when I answered the question there, that this we partly have this problem already now in arts, and for example, people are using GPT-3 and other tools to actually write novels, for example, to write books. People are using these systems to do their arts, and you know, there are others who say that, you know, we should stop it, we should actually control it, because it takes the essence out of creativity, and it, you know, gives the power to those who simply are better at prompt engineering, right? But as you know, realistically, we will move forward with all of these things. It's good to think about it. We should, and we should perhaps, you know, especially here in Estonia, focus more on that. That we know, try to think long term of what are the impacts, what should we do about it? Because currently, as in most cases with AI, the field is just moving ahead so fast, and then people are, you know, months or years back in doing some kind of regulation of that thing. So, for example, currently there's not really a regulation about using these tools for creativity. Yeah, I think this is an important thing to discuss. Yeah.
My question. My question is directly related to operation principles of the hippocampus. Can we say for now that there exists a mathematical presentation of this part of the brain? Or it's so complex that it's impossible to somehow represent our model?
Yeah, so it's a great question of how far are we with understanding the hippocampus. And it's interesting, right? I mean, that's why I showed you also that Demis Hassabis, the CEO of DeepMind, is actually one of the guys who figured out amazing things about hippocampus. But so far, they haven't put it to work. They haven't really figured out how to use it in systems. I mean, they have some papers on it and some things that kind of work, but I think they haven't really used the full power of that system. And the general rule in the brain is that the older the structure, the harder it is actually to figure out what kind of computations it does, because it goes evolutionary then more back into some processes that we don't understand so well. So I think we are pretty far with understanding how the cortex works, also thanks to deep learning. But yeah, in hippocampus, we have ideas. There are mathematical frameworks. If anyone is interested, I'm happy to send some papers. And there's, for example, a recent conference paper showing that, you know, you can, at least in some respect, compare the processes that hippocampus does at least in some tasks, to transformers. That hippocampus does something like transformers. But, you know, in science, the point is this is always evolving. We are learning more and more about the brain, so there will be many things we currently even don't know and cannot know. Yeah. So, but that's why I like to work in this intersection of these fields. Perhaps there will be some interesting ideas. Okay, so thanks very much for what. Oh, there was another hand. Yeah, no problem. I think having this kind of discussion is the best part of a summer school. Yeah, so thanks for all the questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, my question about validation system, when we have a new idea and we think that it's a good idea, but at the same time, if we struggle a lot and we have bad experience in the past, we tend to invalidate our new ideas. So how not to get lost between struggles of having bad experience and still recognizing a new good idea?
Yeah, it's a great question. That, you know, and some of us, fortunately, are also very critical of their own ideas, right? And it might be that the idea of this person, you know, this person drops this idea, is too critical, whereas the other kind of takes this idea and, for example, makes it famous, right? But this is, again, something where there are no clear heuristics. But rather, what the best advice I have for you is that if you have an idea you're unsure about it, then tell this idea to your supervisor, to your fellow PhD students, talk about it, see what happens, right? And this is the purpose of having a supervisor. This is the purpose of having these fellows here with whom you can talk. Sometimes we ourselves are really bad at evaluating ideas, right? Keep that in mind, okay? Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, so let me see, I think, well, let's try to go through what I prepared. Perhaps anyway, all of you know the next example. Raise the hand if you do not know this example. The question is, do you know this? Or raise the hand if you don't know this problem. Okay, well, yeah, I'm in a summer school of smart people, so of course most of you know it. So I won't spend a lot of time in it. I would just say that, the task here is to use 4 straight lines to connect the 9 dots without raising the hand. And most of you have seen this task, so I won't really use a lot of time on it. But what I will tell you is that this task is probably the task that led to this concept of thinking inside or outside the box. Because, and this is the interesting thing about this task, is that when you tell this task to some people who are not solving so much puzzles, for example, then what they automatically kind of assume is that you have to draw these lines somehow within this imaginary box. I mean, the task says nothing that you have to draw them inside this box or inside these dots, right? But you kind of assume it. And that's why it's an interesting task, and that's why I brought it as an example, that basically as soon as you figure out that, oh my God, why did I think that, then the task is simple to solve. And the point I want to make is that often, when we are solving some kind of a task, for example, during our PhD, in our scientific work, then we also have these kinds of boxes. But the problem is they are kind of invisible boxes. We don't know which kinds of boxes they are. We don't know where the constraints actually are. And I will get back to that. But the second point this task very well illustrates when you actually kind of solve this task and take time to solve it, is that there is this time frame where you have no idea of how to actually solve it. You're like, oh, this is crazy, how can I do it? And then suddenly you see it. And for me, this task, therefore, it illustrates very well this kind of a general process that kind of, I think, Andrew Wiles already explained, but now I'm kind of illustrating it like that, you start from somewhere, and you have some kind of a goal, right? The goal is currently up here, right? And then the problem in real life problems in science is you don't know actually how to get there. So you start moving towards it, but you actually don't know how to get closer. You're using a lot of time actually to move in terms of Andrew Wiles to stumble around. And this is the hard part during your PhD, during science, etc. And this is what we discussed now also with the quote of Andrew Wiles. But what I want to say also is that often this function is non-monotonical in the sense that you can have these kinds of aha moments where you actually see the solution to the problem you were working on. And the interesting question we try to understand in our group is what happens here in this junction. What can you do something actually to help a person across this? Can you help the person to solve and figure out the solution to the problem? And to do that, we have to, again, go back and think about what is the problem. And this is where I think the 9-dot problem is very handy, because it basically shows us that when we are combining these pieces, then often we are doing it within some kind of a box, a mental box. Because when we are, for example, behind the computer trying to solve this damn problem, then some pieces of knowledge are active. We are considering these pieces of knowledge, right? But this actually is a box, a mental box, because this means that only some of these knowledge pieces are active, and the hippocampus can combine only some of these knowledge pieces. So actually, there might be that you have many other relevant pieces, but because you have this box, you're not really considering them. And thus, again, to use an analogy, the thing you want to do when you're stuck with some problem is that you somehow want to get rid of this box so you could make these connections, put these pieces together that would actually help you to come to the solution. And thus the problem often is how can you actually get rid of that box? How can you switch basically this mode of thinking that you have? And actually this is also where this thinking of neuroscience is very useful, because remember, I showed you this image about many times, this image about the hippocampus putting pieces to the cortex, right? The interesting thing that we have learned in the past 3 decades is that this process mainly happens when you are actually taking time off, when you're relaxing. For example, this was discovered during sleep. But now we know it's not only during sleep, but rather also when you're awake, but you're not really focusing. You're basically relaxing and not doing anything. This is where the hippocampus starts basically sending more of these combinations to the cortex. Okay? And what it means, yeah, Meelis, go ahead before I say what it means. Let's leave it at that.
Actually, this morning in Eike Hüllermeyer's talk, we saw some box, which was the hypothesis space. So it seems like machine learning very commonly has kind of a box that is defined by the person who is using the model defines maybe the neural architecture or whatever the parametric model is that is being fitted. So that is the box. So, and it seems almost like fundamentally deep learning always will have that box. If we fix an architecture, we will be the slaves of that architecture. Now, in that sense, maybe we cannot get rid of the box. But on the other hand, maybe if we just make the box big enough, we don't care about the box anymore. I mean, our brain is also a box in some sense. We cannot, at least easily, get the computation out from the brain. Augmenting is an option, but for now we are still sticking to our own brain cells. So we do have that box, but maybe we just need to make the box large enough.
Yeah. So that's a very good point, but maybe I didn't even explain the kind of the problem well enough that when you're working on a specific problem, you're trying to solve something, write something, then it's better to say you have many boxes, in the sense that you have many kind of constraints. We discussed these constraints before also, that they are good things, but sometimes they distract you in the sense that you actually have the pieces in your brain to make the damn new solution, but because you have this box, this invisible thing that kind of makes you to consider only these pieces for the solution, you don't come to that. So basically, these are the boxes I mean, that, you know, they are in the end, as I try to illustrate, whether you are stuck with some, okay, no, that was the wrong button. Stuck with some pieces, or you actually consider more pieces. So basically, how large is the search space you're currently using in your brain for a solution? And the point I'm trying to make is that in our brain, it can have different different amplitude or different size, depending on the mode of processing.
If you have a fixed set of Lego bricks with which you do your design, then that's what your box is, and then you're stuck with it. And if you build a neural network, fixing it to build only using some particular Lego bricks, then you're similarly fixing it to a box. So, but then the challenge, it seems, for deep learning is also to find a way to not fixate to a small set of bricks, but rather allow this kind of, I don't know, an open box.
Many different scales for different search programs. And this relates also to what I answered previously to Jaak, right? That in our brains, we have this way of actually changing the scope of the search, basically by these chemicals. And, I wouldn't recommend you to change the chemicals in your brain, but what you can do is really you can basically use this kind of a relaxed mode of processing where you're stuck with a problem, you try to solve it, it doesn't work, then you actually deliberately, on purpose, go to this other mode of processing where you are kind of more relaxed, you're seemingly not so much focused on the problem. And when I have reviewed these different fields and different people kind of coming to ideas, then you have these common kind of processes or common activities that lead to ideas, which people in English have nicely said are 3 Bs. That good ideas come in bus, in bed, and of course in bath, right? Probably you have heard the story about Archimedes coming to a good solution in bath. But while the microphone is going there, I will share you the origin story of why people think good ideas come in the bus. This comes from another mathematician, Henry Poincaré. He was very interested in how creativity works. He wrote many chapters and even a small book on it, where he observed himself coming to solutions. And then this is the case where he actually figured out that, good ideas come during the bus. And he wrote, "The incidents of travel made me forget my mathematical work. We entered an omnibus to go someplace or other, and at the moment when I put my foot on the step, the idea came to me without anything in my former thoughts seeming to have paved the way for it." So that worked for Henry Poincaré. I don't know if it works for you, but this is the origin story of why people think that you can have good ideas in the bus. And as said, these general kind of tools are bus, bed, and bath. There was a question.
Yeah, just to take you back a little bit, I'm just curious about people with insomnia. These guys never sleep, and I wonder, how does their hippocampus does the arrangement for them to be innovative? And I know some of them could be very smart and intelligent, so how do you think this work in the brain? So
of course, to be very precise, then insomnia also is kind of a graded thing. So it's not that these people never sleep. There are to my knowledge, people who never sleep at all. There are simply people who sleep very little. Often also people underestimate their sleep. So when we actually measure their neural activity, then we see that, yeah, they say that they didn't sleep, but actually in their brain they have activity as if they slept. But nevertheless, there is this big variability, and which is, I think, in any case interesting that, we know scientists who sleep like 10 hours, who sleep a lot, and others who sleep 4 and 5 hours. So it seems that, this work of creativity, for example, during sleep, it can also work with a very small time frame. And indeed, when I would come, I don't know if you want to do that, but if we would do it, would put electrodes into your brain when you sleep, then it's the beginning of the sleep, the deep part of the sleep where you actually have this kind of, a lot of these sequences going into the cortex. So it seems that even if people, they don't get so much sleep, they still get that part of the sleep. But there are still many questions we don't know the answer to. So thanks. Okay, so the main thing I want to tell you, I can convey to you, is that there is this interesting paradox that to find solutions to your work problems, you actually sometimes need to take time off. Okay? It's something that, I think PhD students, some PhD students know very well, others don't know at all, but I'm telling to you that this is important. To come to new ideas, you actually need to do that. You need to take time off. That's why I think today's summer school is also great. We have in the evening a lot of time for taking time off, right? But of course, I mean, just to be sure, I'm not telling that, to come to good ideas, you should only take showers, the whole day, basically in bed, bus, and bath, right? No, that's not what I'm telling you, for the record. What I'm telling you is that these solutions, they can come in these relaxed states, given that you have previously put in the work, given that you have previously stumbled around in the dark, and given that you have actually, collected the pieces. So see, this is something we, I already highlighted before, that, Andrew Wiles also said, this stumbling around in the dark is necessary for you to understand actually how important this illumination is, or to realize what it means. And when we look at this model that I showed to you, then also, you cannot really, you can take all the paths in the world, and you can take all the bus trips in the world, but if you do not have these pieces here, then you won't have any insights. You won't have these aha moments, okay? So these two go together. You have to have this kind of time of focus and time of stumbling around. And then, when you're stuck, you think you have enough pieces, then you can take time off. And then the idea might actually come to you. And again, research kind of supports this, that this is how it works. And given what we have learned today, it also makes sense, right? That if you have collected the pieces, it makes sense that you kind of give some kind of possibility for this system to play these sequences, play these combinations into your cortex. Okay, so this is something that I hope that also you will take from today's lecture, that to be able to create and come to new ideas, you need pieces. You need to have these pieces. We previously discussed about knowing the constraints of the field, so we mentioned it a bit. But I think it was made very clear also by the comment of Meelis that, given the Lego pieces you have, you can build different things, right? So this is a constraint. So what I'm telling to you, especially PhD students, is that you should be reading the literature, you should be following the literature, trying to know what others are doing and what are the pieces in your field. Only then you can actually combine it. And that's why I'm also very happy to work here in Delta, because I think it's a very nice building for coming to different pieces. We can bump into different people from the industry side, but also from the different groups, share ideas in the kitchen, because often it's the other people who have the pieces. They might not know it, they might not actually not care about that piece, but given your Lego in your brain, when you talk to this person, to this strange person from this other group, then you realize, oh, this makes sense, and I can now solve it, what I previously couldn't solve. Okay? Yeah, so you have to get the pieces, try to combine them, and only then you can make use of this factory inside your brain. And to finish up, I think it's also important to say that, when we're young, then when we come to an idea, we tend to like it very much. We tend to appreciate it and cherish a lot. But what I want to tell you is that, don't be satisfied with the first idea. If you write a paper, don't be satisfied with the first version, right? Don't be too focused on the first results you have. Rather, seek feedback. Feedback sometimes is hard, especially when given by an Estonian, right? But it's immensely useful because, as we discussed briefly, sometimes you yourself, you don't see the boxes and you don't see the limitations of your knowledge. But then if you get the feedback from your peers or from your supervisor, you can actually maybe see the problems. It's hard when you get this, feedback and everything is in red, but it also helps us. And the point I always try to make is that, when you study even the greatest artists and greatest inventors, then they are happy to do these iterations and to actually also sometimes fail. So I will jump over this example of Beethoven and finish with this example. Some of you know it. It's the example of James Dyson, the inventor of the Dyson vacuum cleaner. I think some of you have his vacuum cleaner at home. He's currently one of the richest persons in Great Britain. But what you might not know is that it took him 15 years to come up with this machine. And that over these 15 years, he created more than 5,000 iterations of this machine. And, we look at him, oh yeah, he's a great inventor, etc. But what we should really cherish is this kind of capability of, for 15 years, trying to invent this machine. I hope your PhD, of course, doesn't take 15 years. You can solve it a bit earlier, but I think it's interesting to keep this in mind. This is what I always tell also to my children, right? That, look at this guy who did more than 5,000 iterations. And here's one famous quote from him, which says that, you have to embrace failure. Failure is part of it, and almost get a kick out of it. So, when I thought of my talk, then I started with this, example of stumbling around in the dark, and now I'm finishing with embrace the failure. So I realized this sounds kind of a bit depressing or pessimistic, but what is the other way, actually? What is the alternative to that? What is the alternative for us? If you want to create something, you want to do something novel, then the alternative to stumbling around and embracing the failure is not trying at all. And I think that's much worse, because as I told you, it's not about talent, it's about how much you try and how much you actually try to solve this problem. So, try it, stumble around, embrace failure, try to enjoy it. I'm sure sooner or later many of you will come to some amazing ideas. Good luck with that. Thanks.
When is the time to quit?
For me, it's in about 4 minutes. But you know, I think even when we talk about creativity in science or arts, then it comes at different times for different people. Yeah, there are people who, when they feel they cannot do it anymore in this field, then they switch. They go to some other field. Sorry. Yeah, exactly. That happens more earlier or later. Yes, that you start teaching, and again there. So again, there are not good heuristics. But I think one heuristic that we kind of learned today is also that it's time to quit at the moment where you write papers that basically rely on your own symbols so much that even your PhD students cannot really read it. Was that a good recipe? No. No, it's okay. Let's discuss a specific plan over the break. There are some more questions also, and one is in the back also. Yeah.
Just a comment. By education, I'm actually a physicist, and in physics, it seems to be at least 10 years. For example, in MIT, Professor Griffin worked on a specific problem in spectroscopy for over 10 years, and now at around, actually even a bit more, and about 15 years ago, everything came together. And now, for example, MRI and all these fields are being revolutionized with like order of magnitude improvements. There were a couple of other people as well, but it took them at least 10 years. And the idea itself is actually 60 years old. And so everybody was thinking that, I heard this lecture, he was saying that everybody was thinking that he's an idiot, but because he was such a tenured professor, then everybody didn't say it into his face, and he could just work on it. And he had unlimited funding because he was in MIT.
Yeah, that's a privilege we don't have here. Yeah, but the general point is, and I think I made it pretty clear that often coming to new ideas is a process that takes years, if not decades, and there's really not a way around it. We should just know it and be ready for it. Yeah.
Yes, Jaak was asking that when is it time to let go. It's like my opinion is that when Jaak says it's time.
Exactly, yeah, but that's a much better answer than the one I gave, yes.
Yeah, but some problems are not solvable. I mean, if you start to prove the existence of God or non-existence of God, then maybe you can't.
Yes, this is an important question of how to actually select the topic that we kind of bypass today. It will be another lecture, another time.
Very few of us ever will win a Nobel Prize. So, but most of us get to do a PhD. So when Jaak says it's good enough, then it's time to move on to other pursuits. You can always do another study.
Yes.
It is preferable rather than do one perfect PhD.
Yeah, don't worry if you
for the rest of your life.
Yeah, don't worry. So don't worry if you don't get a Nobel Prize during your PhD. Okay, it doesn't happen often. There's another question, and I don't know if you, Jaak, want to finish precisely. Then let's keep that the last one. Yeah,
I'll be as quick as possible. So first off, I really appreciate your framework on how you approach this. But the one part that we didn't kind of talk about as much, and it's kind of because in academia, I think it's kind of a given. The appropriateness is approached by doing a literature review, seeing like the state of the art. But when you're talking about other fields like business or something, how would you recommend, like for example, if you want to start a company, appropriateness can be a couple different things, like the technology set, maybe you want to sell your product, the customer. How would you approach solving for those variables in a way that can help someone who wants to start their own company kind of figure out a direction without saying, I'm quitting my PhD and starting to sell this thing?
Yeah. So that's a great question, and you know, I think we can summarize some of the tips. The first thing that I started with is already, you know, you learn from the best, or you try to see, okay, who's the person who does something like that I want to do. Go and talk to him. In Estonia, the startup community is very nice. You can actually go and, you know, sometimes they don't have so much time, but you can go and ask questions about that to actually understand something. And the question you should ask is, what kind of things do I need to know, for example? Because from your perspective, yeah, it seems that it's only about getting the idea, but then when you talk to these people, they say, yeah, actually, we're doing this and that, and, you know, you need this and that. And then try to learn about these things and repeat the process. Again, if you see that, okay, I don't understand that, try to go and talk to people, ask questions, just keep your goal in mind, what you want to achieve, and then repeat the process, stumble around in the dark until you hopefully find the light switch. Thank you very much. Thanks for the questions and for the patience.